For more than 2,400 years, a single story has refused to settle into silence. It has been argued over in libraries and lecture halls, whispered in late-night conversations, chased across oceans, and dismissed with a wave of the hand, only to return again, unchanged, persistent, and strangely alive. Civilizations have risen and fallen since it was first written down, yet the question it raises remains unanswered. What was Atlantis? Was it history carefully preserved through time? Was it myth shaped to teach a lesson rather than record a fact? Or was it something in between, a shadow of truth wrapped in storytelling? The strange thing is not that the story exists. Ancient cultures were full of legends. What makes Atlantis different is how stubborn it has been. It refuses to fade. No matter how often it is explained away, it keeps resurfacing like something submerged but never fully gone. The story comes from a single source. One man, one voice from ancient Greece, Plato, a philosopher, a teacher, a political thinker, not a historian in the modern sense. And yet, because of him, the name Atlantis has echoed across centuries. If you were to trace the origin of this mystery, it would not begin with explorers or archaeologists or scientists scanning the ocean floor. It would begin quietly, in words written long ago, in a world very different from our own. When Plato wrote about Atlantis, the world had no maps of the deep ocean. The Atlantic was not a place of trade or travel. It was a boundary. Beyond it lay uncertainty, darkness, and imagination. To the Greeks it was the edge of everything they knew. And beyond that edge, Plato placed an island, not a small one, not a vague one, a powerful civilization, wealthy, advanced, disciplined, and eventually destroyed. What makes this unsettling is not the drama of its fall, but the confidence with which it is described. Plato did not write, "There is a legend," or some say. Instead, he framed the story as something preserved, passed down, remembered. That choice alone has kept the debate alive, because once a story claims to be history, even quietly, it demands to be questioned. Some readers, across the centuries, accepted Plato's words at face value. They believed Atlantis was real, a forgotten empire swallowed by the sea. Others dismissed it entirely, arguing that Plato was doing what philosophers often do, using stories to teach ideas, not record events. The argument has never truly ended. Roman scholars debated it. Medieval writers speculated about it. Renaissance thinkers searched for it. Modern scientists have tried to measure it, test it, explain it away. And still the story remains. Part of the reason Atlantis refuses to die is how it speaks to something deeply human. It is not just a story about a place. It is a story about loss, about greatness undone, about a world that believed itself permanent until it wasn't. Every age finds something familiar in it. Empires have always been fascinated by Atlantis. So have societies on the brink of change. The idea that a powerful civilization could vanish in a single day and night feels both impossible and uncomfortably plausible. We like to believe that progress protects us, that knowledge, technology, and power make us immune to collapse. Atlantis challenges that belief, quietly but firmly, yet skepticism has always stood beside fascination. Historians point out that no other ancient Greek writer mentions Atlantis, not Herodotus, who travelled and wrote extensively about Egypt, not Thucydides, who documented Athenian history with almost clinical precision, not poets, not scholars, not statesmen, only Plato. That absence is troubling. If Atlantis were real, Why would no one else mention it? Why would such a massive empire leave no trace in shared memory? Why would its destruction echo in only one set of writings? These questions have been asked for centuries and they remain unanswered. Plato himself complicates the matter further. He was known for using myths, allegories, and stories to communicate ideas. Some of his most famous works rely on fictional narratives to explain deep truths about reality, morality, and human nature. So was Atlantis just another of these philosophical tools? Or was it different because Plato did something unusual with this story? He anchored it in names, places, timelines, and measurements. He tied it to real figures from history. He gave it a specific age, a specific location, and a specific chain of transmission. That level of detail feels deliberate, too deliberate to ignore, and yet too perfect to accept without doubt. This tension between belief and skepticism is the heart of the Atlantis mystery. It is why the story has survived when so many others have faded. It exists in a space where certainty cannot settle. For some, Atlantis represents a lost golden age, a reminder that humanity once reached heights we can barely imagine. For others, it is a warning, a symbolic tale about arrogance, excess, and moral decay. And for many, it is simply a question mark, a story that invites curiosity without offering closure. Even today, people search for Atlantis in sunken islands, ancient ruins, and satellite images of the ocean floor. Others search for it in Plato's words, dissecting every sentence, every metaphor, every number. But perhaps the reason Atlantis refuses to die is not because we have failed to find it. Perhaps it is because the story was never meant to be found in one place. Perhaps it was meant to follow us. As you settle into this story, it helps to let go of the need for immediate answers. Atlantis does not reveal itself quickly. It unfolds slowly, layered with history, philosophy, and human experience. It begins not with catastrophe, but with memory, a memory preserved, argued over, and carried forward across centuries. Whether Atlantis was real or imagined, something about it touched a nerve so deep that it continues to resonate long after the world that told it has turned to dust. And that alone makes it worth listening to, because some mysteries are not meant to be solved all at once. Some are meant to be lived with quietly, patiently, across time. To understand Atlantis, you first have to understand the man who wrote about it. Plato was not a distant storyteller inventing fantasies for entertainment. He was deeply shaped by the world he lived in, by its violence, its failures, and its Ken promises. The story of Atlantis did not come from nowhere. It emerged from a lifetime of watching ideals rise and collapse. By the time Plato wrote about Atlantis, he was an old man, around 70 years old, which in ancient Greece was remarkable. Most people did not live that long. Age had slowed him, but it had also sharpened him. He had outlived many of his students, many of his rivals, and almost everyone who had shaped his early life. What remained was memory, reflection, and a deep sense of unfinished work. He spent much of his time in a quiet place outside the walls of Athens, in a grove of olive trees known as the Academy. It was not a building in the modern sense. It was a sacred space, open to the sky, where young men gathered to argue about numbers, justice, and the nature of the soul. Plato had founded this place decades earlier, after returning from years of travel. It was here that he taught, wrote, and thought. And it was here, in the later years of his life, that he began writing something different. But Plato's story begins long before that garden. He was born into privilege, real privilege. His family belonged to the highest ranks of Athenian society. They were wealthy, influential, and politically connected. On his mother's side, they claimed descent from Solon, the famous lawgiver whose reforms shaped Athens itself. On his father's side, they claimed lineage from the god Poseidon. Such claims were common among elite families, but they mattered. They shaped identity. They created expectation. Plato was born into a world where power was assumed to be his future. As a young man, he likely expected to enter politics. It was the natural path for someone of his background. Athens was a democracy, but it was dominated by elite families who understood how to navigate it. Then everything fell apart. Athens lost the Peloponnesian War. After decades of dominance, the city was defeated by Sparta. The empire collapsed, wealth vanished, pride shattered, and in the chaos that followed, Plato watched something far worse than defeat unfold. A group known as the 30 Tyrants took control of Athens. They ruled through fear, executions without trial, confiscated property, exile. Violence became policy. And two of Plato's own relatives stood at the center of it. One was his uncle. Another was a cousin who became the leader of the regime. Plato was young, watching his family turn into symbols of cruelty. Then the tyrants fell. Democracy returned, but it was no longer the same. The city was wounded, angry, and looking for someone to blame. That someone turned out to be a man named Socrates. Socrates was Plato's teacher. More than that, he was the person who taught Plato how to think, how to question assumptions, how to look beneath appearances. Socrates did not write anything down. His legacy lived through conversation, through relentless questioning that made people uncomfortable. In 399 BC, Athens put Socrates on trial. The charges were vag. You are powerful, corrupting the youth, disrespecting the gods of the city. The real reason was simpler. Socrates embarrassed powerful people. He questioned the foundations of authority, and in a wounded city, that made him dangerous. The verdict was guilty. The punishment was death. Socrates drank poison while his students watched. Plato later wrote that he was ill that day and could not attend the execution. Whether that was true or not, the result was the same. Something broke. Plato had watched tyranny destroy Athens. Then he watched democracy execute its own conscience. Neither system looked virtuous anymore. Politics, which once seemed like a path toward justice, now appeared deeply flawed. Plato left Athens. For more than a decade he travelled. Egypt, southern Italy, Sicily. He met priests, mathematicians, philosophers. He studied religious traditions, numbers, geometry, and theories of harmony. These years changed him. They expanded his thinking beyond Athens, beyond Greek assumptions. He began to imagine societies governed not by ambition, but by wisdom. Eventually he returned home and founded the academy. Teaching became his way forward. Writing became his method of preservation. Through dialogues he explored justice, ethics, knowledge, and power. But Plato was not content to remain theoretical. 3 times in his life he attempted to bring philosophy into the real world. 3 times he failed. In the city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily, Plato tried to influence rulers to shape a government guided by reason rather than greed. He believed a philosopher king could exist, someone trained to value truth over power. Instead, he encountered paranoia, betrayal, and violence. At one point, Plato was effectively held prisoner. Only the intervention of powerful friends allowed him to escape. He returned to Athens older, exhausted, and deeply disillusioned. The experiment was over. By the time he sat in his garden writing about Atlantis, Plato had seen every system he believed in fall apart. Aristocracy had become tyranny, democracy had become execution, philosophy had failed in practice. He was a man who had watched ideals collapse under the weight of human weakness. This matters because when Plato wrote about a great civilization that began in virtue and ended in corruption, he was not writing from imagination alone, he was writing from experience. Atlantis was not created by someone who believed the world was stable, it was created by someone who had watched stability dissolve. Plato understood how easily power transforms intention, how wealth reshapes values, how societies convince themselves they are improving while quietly decaying. He was not a dreamer by the end of his life. He was a witness. And that makes his story harder to dismiss, because Atlantis was written not by a naive philosopher, but by someone who had lived through the rise and fall of real cities, real governments, and real people. Whether Atlantis existed or not, he mind that shaped it was grounded in reality, bruised, thoughtful, and searching for meaning in a world that had disappointed him repeatedly. Plato was not chasing fantasy. He was trying to understand why civilizations fail, and sometimes the clearest truths are told through stories that refuse to stay silent. Plato did not grow up on the margins of power. He was born close to it, surrounded by it, shaped by it long before he understood what it could do to people. Power was not an abstract idea in his childhood. It was a presence at the dinner table, in family conversations, in unspoken expectations about who he would become. His family belonged to the old Athenian aristocracy. They owned land, they had wealth, they had names that carried weight. In a society that valued lineage and reputation, Plato's family stood comfortably near the top. From the outside, it must have seemed like an ideal beginning, but power has a way of revealing itself slowly. Athens, during Plato's youth, was not at peace. The city had been locked in a long and brutal conflict with Sparta, a war that drained resources, lives, and hope. For years, Athenians lived under the strain of uncertainty, watching their empire weaken and their confidence erode. When the war finally ended, it did not end cleanly. Athens lost. The defeat was total. The navy was dismantled. The city's great walls were torn down. Pride collapsed along with stone. What followed was not reflection or healing, but fear. Into that fear stepped Plato's relatives, a group of 30 men, later known as the 30 tyrants, were installed to govern the city. They claimed order was necessary, stability, control. In reality, what followed was one of the darkest periods in Athenian history. Two of the most powerful figures among the 30 were closely related to Plato. One was his uncle, another was his cousin, Critias, who emerged as the most ruthless of them all. For 8 months, Athens lived under terror. Executions were carried out without trials. Property was seized. Enemies were eliminated quietly and efficiently. Citizens disappeared. Wealth was redistributed upward. Fear became the language of governance. Plato watched this unfold. There is no record of him participating in these events, no evidence that he supported them. But distance does not erase responsibility when blood is shared. He could not pretend this had nothing to do with him. The city that had taught him about democracy now trembled under oligarchy. The family that had raised him had become symbols of cruelty, and then as quickly as it began, it ended. The 30 tyrants were overthrown. Some were killed, others fled. Democracy returned to Athens, battered and resentful, carrying the scars of what had been done in its name, and against it, Plato's family was disgraced. But disgrace did not bring relief, because the return of democracy did not mean justice. It meant retribution. It meant suspicion. It meant a city desperate to protect itself from future threats, even if that meant silencing inconvenient voices. Plato had seen both sides now. He had seen power concentrated in the hands of elites turn into cruelty, and he had seen popular rule turn into fear-driven judgment. Neither offered comfort. Guilt does not always announce itself loudly. Often it settles quietly, like dust. Plato never wrote openly about his family's role in the tyranny. But silence can carry weight. The absence of defense, the lack of justification, suggests something deeper than denial. He understood what had happened. He understood how easily people justify violence when they believe they are saving a city, how quickly ideals are abandoned when survival feels threatened. These experiences did not leave him angry so much as cautious. He became deeply suspicious of unchecked power, whether held by the few or the many. He no longer trusted that political systems alone could produce justice. This is where guilt transforms into philosophy. Plato began to ask questions that would shape his life's work. What makes a ruler just? What keeps power from corrupting? Can virtue be taught, or is it inevitably eroded by ambition? These were not theoretical questions for him. They were personal. He had watched his relatives claim they were restoring order while committing atrocities. He had watched the city cheer their fall, only to turn and condemn a philosopher who questioned authority too freely. Athens had lost its moral center, and Plato knew that no system had saved it. This awareness changed how he thought about history itself. He no longer believed that cities fell simply because of external enemies. The real danger came from within, from decisions made slowly, quietly, justified at every step. Tyranny, he learned, rarely arrives announcing itself. It wears the language of necessity, of protection, of responsibility, and democracy, when wounded, can be just as dangerous. The guilt Plato carried was not only familial, it was civic. He belonged to a city that had failed itself repeatedly. He belonged to a class that had abused power, and he belonged to a generation that inherited the consequences. This tension appears again and again in his writing, a distrust of ambition, a concern with moral decay, a belief that wealth and power, when pursued without wisdom, rot societies from the inside. These were not abstract fears, they were memories. When Plato later described Atlantis as a civilization that began virtuous and gradually became corrupt, he was not inventing a pattern, he had lived through one. When he described rulers who believed themselves superior and entitled, he had names and faces in mind. And when he wrote about destruction following moral failure, he was not exaggerating. He had watched Athens destroy itself long before enemies finished the job. Guilt does not always ask to be forgiven. Sometimes it asks to be understood. Plato did not try to erase the past. He tried to make sense of it. He tried to understand how good intentions turn violent, how power reshapes values, how families and cities convince themselves they are righteous while doing harm. Atlantis, when it appears later in his writing, carries the weight of this understanding. It is not simply a lost island. It is a reflection of what happens when societies forget restraint, when lineage becomes entitlement, when strength replaces wisdom. Plato knew that stories could reach people in ways arguments could not. Facts provoke resistance. Stories invite reflection. And reflection, he believed, was the only path left. The boy born into power became a man haunted by its misuse. The philosopher shaped by tyranny and guilt learned to distrust appearances. He understood that the most dangerous collapses happen slowly, long before walls fall or oceans rise, and that understanding would quietly shape everything he wrote, including the story of Atlantis. Some moments divide a life into before and after. For Plato, that moment was the death of Socrates. Before it, the world still felt uncertain but improvable. After it, something essential was gone, something that could never be restored. Not just a teacher, not just a friend, but a living example of what it meant to think freely and live honestly. Socrates was unlike anyone else in Athens. He did not write books. He did not claim wisdom. He walked the streets, stood in marketplaces, and asked questions. Simple questions at first. What is justice? What is courage? What is virtue? And then, gently but relentlessly, he exposed how fragile people's answers were. He embarrassed generals, politicians, poets, and craftsmen alike, not with insults, but with patience. He made people confront what they did not know. For many, this was intolerable. To Plato, Socrates was a guide. He showed that truth mattered more than reputation, that moral clarity was more important than comfort, that a good life was not measured by wealth or power, but by integrity. Plato followed him closely, listened, learned, questioned himself. Then Athens put Socrates on trial. The city was still raw from defeat, still fearful of instability. Democracy had been restored, but it was defensive, suspicious, and fragile. The memory of tyranny lingered, and the desire to prevent its return shaped every decision. Socrates, with his questioning, became a convenient target. The charges were carefully chosen. He was accused of corrupting the youth and failing to respect the gods of the city. On paper, these were religious offences. In reality, they were political. Socrates made people think, and thinking, in a wounded city, felt dangerous. The trial itself was not dramatic in the way modern trials are imagined. It was procedural, ordinary, almost mundane. A group of citizens listened, debated, and voted. They found him guilty. When asked to propose a punishment, Socrates did something that sealed his fate. He refused to beg, refused to flatter, refused to pretend he was sorry for living the W. He suggested, with quiet irony, that he deserved to be rewarded rather than punished. The jury was not amused. They sentenced him to death. The method was poison. Plato later wrote that he was ill on the day Socrates was executed and could not be present. Whether illness kept him away or grief made attendance unbearable, the result was the same. He was spared the sight, but not the consequence. Socrates died calmly, according to those who were there. He spoke to his students until the end, urging them to care for their souls more than their bodies. He accepted the sentence not because it was just, but because breaking the law, even unjustly applied, would damage the city further. This mattered deeply to Plato, because Athens had not been ruled by tyrants that day. It had been ruled by citizens, ordinary men, voting according to their conscience or their fear. The city that prided itself on freedom had executed a man for thinking differently. This realization cut deeper than the tyranny ever had. Plato had already seen power abused by elites. Now he saw it abused by the majority. Justice, he learned, was not guaranteed by numbers any more than by lineage. The death of Socrates shattered his remaining faith in politics as a path to virtue. He did not respond with anger or rebellion. He responded with withdrawal. Plato left Athens soon after. For years he wandered, Egypt, Italy, Sicily. He searched for wisdom outside the city that had betrayed his teacher. He studied traditions older than Greek democracy, older than its conflicts. But no matter where he went, the memory followed him. Socrates became a presence in Plato's writing, not as a character frozen in time, but as a voice that questioned everything. In dialogue after dialogue, Socrates appears asking questions, refusing easy answers, exposing arrogance. Writing became Plato's way of preserving what Athens had destroyed, but preservation alone was not enough. Plato wanted to understand how a city could execute its best conscience and still call itself just, how fear could override wisdom, how people could convince themselves they were protecting democracy while silencing dissent. These questions haunted him. They appear in his distrust of unchecked democracy, in his belief that rulers must be educated in virtue, in his conviction that justice requires more than laws. It requires wisdom, and they appear subtly in the story of Atlantis, because Atlantis, like Athens, is not destroyed by an outside enemy alone. It collapses after losing moral balance, after confusing strength with righteousness, after silencing restraint. Socrates had been a restraint. He slowed people down, forced them to reflect, challenged assumptions. Without him, Athens lost a mirror. Plato never forgot that. He understood that cities often eliminate the very voices that could save them, that truth is uncomfortable and discomfort is often punished, that societies under stress seek certainty, not wisdom, the death of Socrates taught him that justice is fragile, that laws can be used to commit injustice while appearing righteous, that a crowd can be more dangerous than a tyrant when guided by fear. These lessons were not abstract. They were personal. Plato's grief did not fade quickly. It transformed. It hardened into resolve. He would not engage in politics directly again. He would not place his trust in popular opinion. Instead, he would build something quieter, a place where thinking was protected, the academy, a space where questions could be asked without fear of execution, where young minds could be trained to value truth over applause, where philosophy could survive even if cities failed. The story of Atlantis would later emerge from this environment, from a man who had watched wisdom be put to death by the very society it tried to improve. This is why Atlantis carries such weight. It is not a fantasy written for amusement. It is shaped by grief, disillusionment, and careful thought. It reflects a belief that civilizations destroy themselves not because they lack power, but because they silence conscience. Socrates died quietly, but the echo of his death traveled far. It reshaped Plato's life, his philosophy, his understanding of history, and his belief that stories sometimes carry truths that arguments cannot. Some deaths end a life. Others change the course of thought forever, and this one did both. Leaving Athens was not an act of rebellion, it was an act of retreat. After the death of Socrates, the city no longer felt like home to Plato. Its streets were familiar, its temples unchanged, but something essential had shifted. The place where questions once felt safe now felt dangerous. Silence seemed wiser than speech. So Plato left, not in anger, not dramatically, but quietly. He stepped away from the city that had shaped him, carrying with him grief, doubt, and a growing sense that the ideals he had inherited were no longer sufficient. For more than a decade, Plato lived as a traveller. He moved through lands older than Greece, through cultures shaped by different gods, different customs, and different understandings of order. These journeys were not adventures in the modern sense. Travel in the ancient world was slow, uncertain, and often dangerous. But Plato kept moving. He was searching. Egypt was one of his first major stops. To the Greeks, Egypt was ancient beyond comprehension. Its temples had already stood for thousands of years. Its priests preserved records that reached back further than Greek memory could follow. Plato listened. He encountered a culture that valued continuity over change, preservation over innovation, where rituals repeated endlessly, anchoring the present to the distant past. Knowledge was not debated openly in marketplaces. It was guarded, passed down carefully, protected from disruption. This was a sharp contrast to Athens, where ideas clashed loudly and publicly. In Egypt, Plato encountered a different relationship with time. History did not feel fragile there. It felt layered, accumulated, slow-moving. This left an impression. From Egypt, Plato travelled to southern Italy, where he encountered followers of Pythagoras. These thinkers believed that reality itself was structured by numbers and harmony. Mathematics was not merely a tool, it was a reflection of cosmic order. Plato found this idea compelling. Numbers were stable, ratios were constant. Geometry did not argue. In a world where politics shifted violently and justice felt unreliable, mathematics offered certainty. The universe perhaps had an order even if cities did not. In Sicily, Plato came closest to turning philosophy into action. There he encountered power again, not abstract power, but living rulers, courts, ambition, fear. The city of Syracuse was wealthy, influential, and unstable. Its leaders were suspicious, competitive, and surrounded by intrigue. Plato believed, briefly, that wisdom could guide authority. He believed that if a ruler were educated properly, trained in philosophy, taught to value truth over pleasure, then power might finally serve justice. This belief did not survive contact with reality. Plato saw how paranoia infected leadership, how rulers feared rivals more than injustice, how flattery mattered more than reason. Philosophy, which thrived in quiet conversation, suffocated under the weight of ambition. Each attempt to influence governance ended in frustration, misunderstanding, or danger. Gradually, Plato's optimism eroded. He began his travels believing that better systems could save societies, that knowledge alone could correct corruption, that education could tame power. By the end, those beliefs lay broken. What remained was a more sober understanding. Human nature mattered more than laws. Virtue could not be imposed, it had to be cultivated, and even then it was fragile. Plato returned to Athens changed. The city he came back to was no longer an empire. It was smaller, quieter, humbled. The wounds of war and tyranny still shaped daily life. But for Plato, Athens was no longer the center of possibility. It was simply the place where he would build something different. He founded the academy not as a political institution but as a refuge. Here, ideals could survive without being forced into practice prematurely. Here, philosophy could exist without serving ambition. Here, questions could be asked without fear. But even in this quieter life, Plato was not at peace. His travels had shown him the limits of idealism. He no longer believed in perfect solutions. He had seen too much. He understood that civilizations did not collapse overnight. They drifted, slowly, almost invisibly. Small compromises accumulated until nothing solid remained. This understanding settled into his thinking. He began to see history not as progress, but as cycles, ages of order followed by decay, wisdom followed by arrogance, balance followed by excess. It was during this period that Plato's writing deepened. His earlier dialogues are energetic, questioning, hopeful. His later works are heavier, more reflective, sometimes bleak. They carry the weight of experience. Atlantis belongs to this later phase, the story of a great civilization that believed itself enlightened, prosperous, and secure, only to fall because it forgot restraint, reflects Plato's own journey. He had once believed Athens represented the pinnacle of human achievement. He had watched it fall. He had believed philosophy could guide rulers. He had watched it fail. The ideals were not wrong, they were incomplete. Travel had taught Plato that wisdom without humility becomes arrogance, that power without self-control becomes destruction, that wealth without virtue rots societies from the inside. These lessons did not make him cynical, they made him careful. Plato did not abandon hope, he redefined it. Hope no longer meant saving cities. It meant preserving understanding. It meant planting ideas that might outlive the failures of any one society. Stories became one of his tools. Stories could cross generations. They could survive where laws could not. They could carry warnings without issuing commands. Atlantis, when it appears, carries the imprint of exile and disappointment. It is not written by a man who believes the world is easily fixed. It is written by someone who has seen ideals fracture under pressure. The journey had stripped away illusions. What remained was clarity. Plato had travelled far, but the most important distance he crossed was internal, from youthful confidence to quiet awareness, from belief in systems to belief in character, from certainty to reflection. Exile had broken his ideals, travel had reshaped them, and in the quiet spaces that followed, he began to write not about what should be, but about what happens when people forget what should be. That understanding would give birth to one of the most enduring stories ever told, not as a promise, but as a warning. For a long time, Plato carried a single hope quietly within him. It was the belief that wisdom and power did not have to live apart. If the right person ruled, someone trained not in ambition but in understanding, then a city might finally escape the cycle of corruption and collapse. Violence would not be needed. Fear would not rule. Reason would guide authority. This idea would later become famous as the dream of the philosopher king. But before it became theory, it was something far more fragile. It was an experiment. Plato did not imagine this dream from a distance. He tested it in the real world, among real rulers, where consequences were sharp and unforgiving. That place was Syracuse. Syracuse was one of the most powerful cities in the Greek world. Wealth flowed through its harbours, armies protected its walls. Its rulers lived surrounded by luxury and suspicion in equal measure. Plato arrived there believing that philosophy might soften power. He encountered Dion, a member of the ruling family, intelligent and curious, drawn to ideas beyond conquest and pleasure. Dion believed that Plato's teachings could reform Syracuse from within. Together, they believed that if the ruler could be guided toward wisdom, the city itself might change. The ruler was Dionysius. He was young, insecure, and accustomed to absolute authority. He had inherited power in a city where betrayal was common and survival depended on control. Every smile could conceal a threat. Every silence could signal rebellion. Into this environment, Plato introduced ideas of restraint, justice, and self-mastery. At first Dionysius listened. He was intrigued by philosophy, flattered by the idea that he might be capable of wisdom. Plato spoke not of taking power, but of mastering desire, not of obedience, but of order. But philosophy demands patience. Power rarely has it. As time passed, tension grew. Dionysius became suspicious. Philosophy began to feel less like guidance and more like judgment. Plato's presence reminded him of his own shortcomings. What began as curiosity turned into resentment. Plato discovered something essential during this time. A ruler may admire wisdom, but that does not mean he will submit to it. Power resists limits. When philosophy challenges comfort, it becomes dangerous. Dionysius eventually turned against Plato. Dion was exiled. Plato himself was placed under guard, his safety uncertain. At one point, his life was genuinely at risk. The dream collapsed quietly, not with speeches or battles, but with distrust and fear. Plato left Syracuse disillusioned, but the story did not end there. Years later, against his better judgment, Plato returned. Dionysius the Younger now ruled, and there was renewed hope that the new generation might succeed where the old had failed. Plato hesitated, aware of the risks, aware of the past. Still he returned. The same pattern unfolded: initial enthusiasm, philosophical discussions, promises of reform, and then resistance. Dionysius enjoyed the appearance of wisdom more than its discipline. Philosophy became a decoration, not a guide. When challenged to change his behavior, he withdrew. Once again, Plato found himself powerless. The realization settled slowly but firmly. Wisdom cannot be forced into power. A ruler may learn ideas, but without inner discipline they remain words. Education alone does not produce virtue. Authority magnifies character, it does not create it. Plato had believed that philosophy could rule through a king. He learned that kingship reshapes philosophy instead. This failure wounded him deeply. It was not just political disappointment, it was personal. He had risked his safety, his reputation, his peace of mind for this belief, and it had failed not once, but twice. The philosopher king, as a living possibility, was gone. But Plato did not abandon the idea entirely. He transformed it. In his writing, the philosopher king becomes an ideal, not a blueprint, a standard against which real rulers could be met. Measured, not a practical expectation. The idea survives as a contrast. It shows how far power usually falls from wisdom. This shift is important. Plato no longer writes as someone who expects the world to improve easily. He writes as someone who understands resistance, fear, and human weakness. Atlantis reflects this understanding. Its rulers begin wise, disciplined, restrained, but over time, power erodes their balance. The divine element fades. Human desire grows louder. The same pattern Plato witnessed in Syracuse unfolds on a grander scale. The failed dream taught him that decline is rarely sudden. It happens when leaders stop listening, when comfort replaces reflection, when authority no longer tolerates challenge. Plato returned to Athens older, quieter, and far more cautious. He withdrew fully from political engagement. The academy became his focus. There he could train minds without demanding control. He could explore ideals without forcing them into unwilling hands. The philosopher king would live on only in thought, and perhaps that was enough. Plato had tried to bring philosophy into the palace. He learned that wisdom thrives better in simplicity than in luxury. That truth prefers dialogue over command. That power does not like to be instructed. The dream had failed, but it left behind clarity. Plato now understood the limits of human governance. He understood that even the best ideas collapse when paired with unchecked authority. That inner discipline matters more than external systems. This understanding deepened his storytelling. Atlantis is not ruled by monsters or fools. It is ruled by capable leaders who gradually forget restraint. Their failure is not ignorance, it is excess, just like Syracuse, just like Athens. The philosopher king did not arrive, but the lesson did, and it would echo quietly through everything Plato wrote thereafter. By the time Plato began writing about Atlantis, he was no longer young. The urgency that once pushed him into politics had softened. The sharp confidence of his early years had given way to something quieter, heavier, and more reflective. He had seen ideals rise and fall. He had watched wisdom ignored. He had survived disappointment without becoming bitter. Now he spent most of his days at the academy. The world beyond its walls continued as it always had. Ambition, conflict, pride, fear. But Plato no longer rushed toward it. He observed, he listened, he thought. Age does this to a philosopher. It strips away the desire to win arguments and replaces it with the need to understand patterns. Not isolated events, but the shapes they form over time. Plato had come to believe that truth does not always survive confrontation. Sometimes it survives concealment. Sometimes it lasts longer when wrapped in narrative rather than stated directly. So he turned to stories, not myths in the old poetic sense, filled with dramatic gods and heroic battles, but something more restrained. Stories that sounded historic. Measured. Almost believable, Atlantis appears in this stage of his life. It does not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It is introduced quietly within a dialogue, spoken by characters recalling an old account. There is no announcement that something extraordinary is about to be revealed. This is deliberate. Plato was careful. He did not present Atlantis as a fantasy. He presented it as a memory, a story passed down, an account preserved through generations. The tone is calm, controlled, almost distant. This distance matters. A tired philosopher does not shout warnings. He does not preach. He describes. He lets the listener notice the pattern on their own. Atlantis is described with precision, measurements, geography, political structure, resources, rituals. Plato lingers on details that a storyteller inventing purely for entertainment would likely ignore. The care suggests purpose, but the purpose is not spectacle, it is reflection. Plato had learned that people resist being told they are wrong. They resist direct criticism, but they will listen to stories, especially stories about others. Especially stories set far away long ago. A story creates space. In that space, uncomfortable truths can exist without provoking defense. Atlantis allowed Plato to speak about power without naming Athens, about corruption without accusing Syracuse, about decline without pointing fingers. He could explore what happens when wealth grows faster than wisdom, when technology outpaces restraint, when success breeds arrogance. These were not hypothetical concerns. They were lived experiences. Plato had seen cities intoxicated by their own strength. He had seen rulers confuse dominance with virtue. He had seen societies punish those who questioned them. Atlantis becomes a mirror, but it is a subtle one. The people of Atlantis are not evil. They are not foolish. They are capable, organized, and admired. Their society begins balanced. Their rulers are disciplined. Their laws reflect harmony. This is important. Plato does not write a cautionary tale about barbarians. He writes about a civilization that looks in many ways ideal, because decline does not begin with villains, it begins with comfort. As Plato describes Atlantis, there is no anger in his tone, no bitterness, just observation, like a man watching the tide pull something slowly out to sea. The gods are present, but distant. They do not interfere constantly. They observe, much like Plato himself now did. This reflects a shift. Earlier philosophers sought to change the world directly. Plato now understood that influence often comes indirectly, through students, through writing, through stories that outlive the writer. Atlantis is placed within a conversation about memory and time. It is said to be ancient even by ancient standards. This stretches the listener's imagination. It creates a sense of depth, of cycles repeating long before any single city existed. This matters to Plato. He no longer believed that any society was unique in its greatness or its failure. Patterns repeat, names change, circumstances differ, but human nature remains consistent. The story of Atlantis is calm because its author is calm, not hopeful, not despairing, aware. Plato knew that his readers might argue over whether Atlantis was real. He may have expected it. Debates distract from reflection. While people argue about location and evidence, the deeper message slips quietly into thought. This is not accidental. A tired philosopher understands distraction. He uses it. Atlantis is strange because it does not behave like a normal myth. It stops abruptly. It lacks a dramatic conclusion. The dialogue breaks off. There is no emotional resolution. This unsettles readers. But for Plato, completeness was not the goal. He had learned that life rarely offers neat endings. Civilizations fade, stories fragment, memory erodes. Atlantis ends the way many societies do, not with a final speech, but with silence. This silence is intentional. Plato does not explain everything. He does not moralize openly. He trusts the reader to sit with the discomfort. Only someone no longer seeking approval writes this way. Only someone free from ambition leaves questions unanswered. Plato had reached a stage where influence mattered more than agreement, where planting uncertainty was more valuable than asserting certainty. Atlantis is written by a man who no longer expects to save cities, but he still hopes to reach minds in the quiet. Hours at the academy, surrounded by students who would carry his ideas forward, Plato wrote carefully, slowly, with restraint, not to impress, not to persuade forcefully, but to preserve a warning that could survive the fall of any one society. The strange story was not meant to be understood quickly. It was meant to endure. And like all enduring things, it was shaped not by urgency, but by patience. By a philosopher who had seen too much to shout and understood enough to whisper. Plato's dialogues often read like conversations in a quiet room, the kind where ideas drift slowly between people, curling like smoke from a small fire. Most of his works are familiar in this way. Socrates questions, others respond, thoughts unfold gently, sometimes teasingly. But the dialogues that introduce Atlantis, Timaeus, and Critias are different. They do not feel like ordinary philosophical conversations. They are heavier, more deliberate, more measured, as though the very words themselves are carrying a weight beyond the immediate discussion. In Timaeus, the discussion begins almost casually. Socrates, the ever-curious observer, asks his companions to consider the ideal state in action. They have spoken at length about justice, virtue, and governance. Now he seeks a story, a concrete example of the principles they have debated. But what comes next is not a story about Athens or even Greece. It is something far more extraordinary. Critias begins the tale. He does so in a calm, almost scholar tone, as if reporting history rather than inventing it. He attributes the story to ancient sources, passing it down through a chain that stretches across centuries. Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, is said to have learned it from Egyptian priests. These priests, keepers of records older than any Greek history, told of a mighty island civilization that existed 9,000 years before Solon's time. The story is precise. The priests, it seems, were meticulous. They preserved not only events but details, geography, measurements, governance, and rituals. It is this level of specificity that makes the account extraordinary. Plato does not simply describe an island that existed. He sketches its rivers, its canals, its walls, and the buildings within. He names metals, dimensions, and even the rituals of kings. The precision is almost obsessive. In these dialogues, the ordinary rhythm of conversation shifts. Socrates is present, but he does not dominate. Critias speaks at length, almost like a historian recounting carefully preserved memory. Timaeus provides context, explaining natural philosophy, the workings of the cosmos, the order of time and space. Together, the dialogues form a structure that is part history, part philosophical reflection, and part storytelling. The tone is calm, yet strange. Plato avoids sensationalism. There are no heroes leaping dramatically into battle, no loud proclamations of empire. Instead, the emphasis is on order, on structure, on the rise and decline of civ. Illization. Atlantis is described as sophisticated and organized, governed by laws and populated by disciplined rulers. Plato frames the story carefully. Critias claims it is true, a record preserved by memory and oral transmission. But even as he speaks with authority, there is a subtle distance. The dialogue does not insist on belief. It does not demand certainty. It presents the account with an almost quiet insistence that the listener reflect rather than accept blindly. This is unusual for Plato. His earlier dialogues often convey ideas through argument, through back-and-forth probing, teasing out truth by questioning. Timaeus and Critias feel less like debate and more like testimony. They are more like a careful lecture, measured and precise, meant to leave a lasting impression rather than provoke immediate response. The structure of the dialogues also contributes to this strangeness. Timaeus sets the stage, grounding the story in philosophical context, exploring the nature of the universe, the creation of the world, and the principles that govern it. It is calm, reflective, and deliberate, almost hypnotic in its pacing. The listener is invited to settle into the rhythm of the world itself, to feel the weight of time and history. Critias follows, narrating the story of Atlantis. The island is enormous, larger than Libya and Asia combined, with concentric rings of land and water. The central city is fortified and magnificent, its walls covered in metals that gleam in the Sunlight. Canals connect the different rings, allowing ships to sail smoothly from the sea to the heart of the city. Every detail is precise, almost architectural, as if Plato were describing blueprints rather than imagination. Even the Atlantean rulers are described with care. They begin as virtuous, disciplined and just, descended from the god Poseidon. Their laws are elaborate but fair, designed to maintain harmony and prevent excess. Over time, however, the divine element fades. Generations marry mortals, human desires and flaws grow stronger, and the once perfect rulers become corrupt. It is not a tale of immediate disaster but of gradual decay, slow and almost imperceptible. The dialogues carry a subtle tension beneath their calm surface. There is no shouting, no dramatic conflict, yet the reader senses the inevitability of decline. Everything is moving toward a silent, inexorable conclusion. Atlantis, like the civilizations Plato observed in life, will fall, not because of invasion, but because of internal decay, ambition, and forgotten virtue. Plato's careful writing style amplifies this effect. The narration is patient, descriptive, and almost hypnotic. The world he builds is vivid yet distant. The listener feels removed, observing history unfold from a quiet, safe vantage point. It is a storytelling technique that encourages reflection rather than emotional reaction. Even the dialogue itself is unusual in its pacing. It moves slowly, deliberately, with long passage. Of description and observation. Characters do not interrupt each other. The rhythm is more meditative than conversational, more instructive than performative. It is almost as if Plato were reading the story aloud in a quiet garden, letting the details sink in gently, letting the imagination wander freely. The strange structure also reflects Plato's own experiences. A man who had seen political idealism fail, who had witnessed rulers corrupted by ambition, and who had travelled to lands older than Greece, now writes with patience and distance. He is no longer seeking immediate influence. He is planting ideas that may take root long after his voice has faded. This is why Timaeus and Critias are not ordinary dialogues. They are not designed to win arguments or sway opinions in the moment. They are designed to endure. They are designed to preserve a pattern, a lesson, and a warning. Atlantis is an ideal and a caution, described with precision, yet presented in a calm, almost hypnotic tone. The dialogues blend history, philosophy, and storytelling so seamlessly that the boundary between reality and allegory becomes blurred. Listeners are left suspended between belief and imagination, reflection and wonder. They are invited not to accept blindly, but to consider the lessons embedded in the rise, order, and eventual decline of a great civilization. Plato's tired hand, his reflective mind, and his careful observation converge in these dialogues. The weight of decades of travel, disappointment, and observation has shaped the narrative. It is not just a story about an island that may or may not have existed. It is a story about human nature, about civilization, about the fragile balance between virtue and ambition. By the end of Critias, the account is both detailed and incomplete. The final destruction of Atlantis is hinted at but never fully described. Plato leaves it unfinished. There is no dramatic climax, no fiery conclusion, only a sense of inevitability, a quiet understanding that even the mightiest civilizations carry the seeds of their own decline. The dialogues stand apart from Plato's earlier works, not in quality but in purpose and tone. They are reflective, measured, and deliberate, written by a man who no longer seeks to control events, but seeks to preserve wisdom through careful observation. Timaeus and Critias are, in every sense, not normal dialogues. They are meditations, architectural in precision, philosophical in depth, and timeless in their quiet authority. They are the foundation upon which the story of Atlantis endures, a story that will be debated, imagined, and dreamed of for thousands of years to come. And in this careful, calm telling, one can almost feel Plato himself seated among the olive trees of the Academy, watching, listening, and recording the lessons of history for anyone patient enough to hear them. Long before Plato wrote the story of Atlantis, the memory of it was said to have been preserved far to the south, Acro, SS deserts and along the Great Nile, in the land of Egypt. Egypt was ancient, even in Plato's time. Its temples, pyramids, and tombs had already stood for centuries, and the priests who guarded their secrets believed that knowledge could survive millennia if properly recorded. Solon, one of Athens' greatest lawgivers, visited Egypt around 590 BC. He was a man who valued order and reason, a mind attuned to both laws and morality, yet even a mind like his could not hope to comprehend all the secrets the Egyptians held. They spoke of events so ancient that the Greeks had no memory of them. They told Solon that the history of mankind stretched far beyond what any Greek records could show, back through generations, through floods, fires, wars, and countless rises and falls of civilizations. Among these ancient tales, one story stood out. The priests spoke of an island civilization that existed 9,000 years before Solon's time. Think of that, 9,000 years before 590 BC, placing it roughly in the depths of the post-Ice Age world, a time when the seas were still settling and humans were only beginning to build the first villages and settlements. Plato relays this with calm precision, as if the number itself were a matter of careful calculation, not exaggeration. The claim is staggering. It stretches the imagination. It suggests a world that existed long before the cities and kingdoms the Greeks considered their ancestors. It implies that the memory of human achievement could survive, equally preserved even as generations passed, even as civilizations disappeared. The Egyptians, with their temples and sacred archives, were considered guardians of such knowledge. They believed that history was cyclical, that humanity would rise, flourish, and decline repeatedly. Their records were meticulous, carved in stone, preserved in papyri, and remembered through ritual. They spoke not only of events but of lessons, of the dangers of pride, of the necessity of virtue, of the fragility of civilization. When Solon returned to Athens, he carried these stories in his mind, but he did not immediately share them. Greece, after all, was in a state of recovery from war and political upheaval. Solon knew that tales of ancient empires rising and falling might be dismissed as fantasy, or worse, invite envy and fear. So he kept the story, transmitting it carefully through trusted channels, eventually to Critias's family. Plato would later pick up this chain of memory, writing it into dialogue with quiet authority, presenting it not as fiction, but as history passed down from those with knowledge older than Greece itself. The claim of 9,000 years is more than a number. It is a statement about scale and perspective. Plato uses it to stretch the mind, to place his audience into the vast expanse of human history. It is easy to think of history as something recent, bounded by the lifetimes of grandparents or rulers. But by invoking such antiquity, the story invites reflection on pattern, on cycles of virtue and corruption, on the rise and fall of societies, on the impermanence of even the greatest human achievements. The priests of Egypt described Atlantis not only as ancient, but as extraordinary. Its rulers were descended from the god Poseidon, its citizens organized and disciplined, its resources abundant. It was a society balanced by law, order, and virtue. And yet, even as the divine element tempered them, the story emphasizes the vulnerability inherent in human nature. Power and wealth, if unchecked, would erode wisdom and lead to decline. Solon's visit to Egypt also reveals something about human memory and perception. The Greeks, he was told, remembered only a fraction of history, and that fraction was already distorted. Entire generations of events were forgotten. Catastrophes erased cities, wars destroyed archives, and floods swept away settlements. Yet some knowledge could endure if preserved in the right hands. It was not mere storytelling, it was survival. Memory, like a river, finds its way through time, sometimes disappearing beneath sediment only to resurface later in careful observation. Plato's presentation of this story is calm, methodical, almost hypnotic. He does not ask his listeners to believe the Egyptians blindly, nor to accept the 9,000 years as absolute fact. He allows the narrative to unfold with measured precision, presenting it as testimony passed through generations. The listener is invited to reflect, to imagine, and to consider. What lessons such antiquity might hold! The concept of a civilization so old, so distant from Athens, challenges perception. It encourages humility. If great cities like Athens can rise and fall, what can we learn from societies that disappeared long before our records began? Solon's account, transmitted through Critias and preserved by Plato, offers a way to ponder these questions without insisting on certainty. It is a gentle invitation to curiosity, not a demand for belief. The Egyptians' version of history also underscores the interplay between myth and memory. They remembered catastrophes that Greeks had forgotten. They preserved stories of empires submerged by the sea, rulers corrupted by ambition, and societies undone not by outside enemies, but by the quiet decay of virtue. This memory is not merely moralizing, it is observational. It records consequences, not judgments, offering a mirror for those who come later to examine. By connecting Solon's journey to Atlantis, Plato bridges worlds. Greek and Egyptian, contemporary and prehistoric, human and divine. He threads a story across time, giving it both depth and weight. The 9,000-year claim is not meant to dazzle. It is meant to position the listener in a broader framework, to feel the slow unfolding of history, and to understand that human challenges, virtue, governance, greed, and pride, transcend individual lifetimes. The story also conveys a sense of wonder. Ancient Egyptians, with their meticulous record-keeping, suggest that knowledge can endure if cared for properly. The world is older than our memories, larger than our maps, and more complex than our immediate experience. Atlantis, as reported by Solon and recounted by Plato, becomes a lens through which one can contemplate the vastness of time and the fragility of human endeavor. Finally, the calm of Plato's storytelling reflects the patience required to consider such scales. He does not rush. He does not dramatize. He allows the listener to sit with the numbers, the details, and the implications. 9,000 years is not simply a measurement. It is a reminder of the continuity and impermanence of human civilization, a reflection of the cycles that shape history across the millennia. In this way, Egypt, Solon, and the 9,000-year claim provide not only the backdrop for Atlantis, but also a quiet meditation on time, memory, and human nature. It is a story to be absorbed slowly, with attention and contemplation, like watching the slow rise and fall of the tide. And within that stillness, the world of Atlantis begins to take shape, measured, deliberate, and full of lessons for any who pause to listen. The Greeks knew the Mediterranean as a world of familiar coasts, islands, and currents. They had sailed its waters, traded along its shores, and mapped its ports. Beyond its familiar boundaries, however, lay mystery. Beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage the Greeks called the Pillars of Hercules, the Atlantic stretched into unknown vastness. It was a place of whispers, of impossible waves, and stories of lands unseen. It is here, beyond what anyone could safely navigate, that Plato places Atlantis. Not in a nearby sea, not within easy reach of Athens or Egypt, but across the threshold of the known world. He describes it with deliberate care, as if location itself is a part of the lesson. Atlantis exists where verification is impossible, where imagination and observation must meet. To the Greeks, the Pillars of Hercules represented the edge of the world. Beyond them, the ocean was immense, untamed, and potentially fatal. Sailors spoke of monsters in these waters, whirlpools that could swallow ships, and islands that vanished in storms. By situating Atlantis here, Plato situates it at the boundary of knowledge. It is a liminal place, both real and symbolic, where human curiosity and the unknown meet. Plato is precise yet mysterious. He does not offer coordinates in a modern sense, but he provides measurements and directions in ways familiar to his contemporaries. Atlantis lies beyond the Mediterranean, across the strait, in a vast ocean that dwarfs the land of Greece. The narrative gives it scale as well as distance, a continent-sized island, larger than Libya and Asia combined. It is a place both grand and unreachable, an entire world removed from the experience of ordinary Greeks. The location matters. By placing Atlantis at the edge of the known world, Plato ensures that it functions on multiple levels. It is a historical possibility, preserved in memory and oral tradition, yet it is also allegorical. The distance emphasizes otherness. It is far enough that the story cannot be immediately tested, yet close enough that it could, in theory, exist. This tension between plausibility and impossibility invites reflection. Plato's description of Atlantis's setting is detailed. Mountains ring its interior, protecting fertile plains from harsh northern winds. Canals stretch across the land, connecting the inner city with the sea. The concentric rings of water and land are designed for both defense and symbolism. The geography is deliberate, designed to impress the imagination as much as to convey political and philosophical lessons. The positioning of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean is more than a matter of storytelling convenience. It mirrors the distance between ideal and real, between virtue and corruption, between human aspiration and inevitable imperfection. The ocean is a threshold, a place where order must contend with chaos. Atlantis, in its grandeur, exists at this edge, where human ambition can be imagined at its peak and its failure at its most dramatic. Plato is calm in his narration. He does not dramatize the journey to Atlantis. There are no heroic voyages, no storms or battles at sea. The story is measured. Its geography is a backdrop for reflection, not adventure. The Atlantic, vast and distant, becomes a silent witness to the rise and fall of an empire that exceeded the bounds of human wisdom. There is symbolism in the location as well. Water, for Plato, represents change, fluidity, and the uncontrollable forces of nature. By surrounding Atlantis with the Atlantic, he places civilization in dialogue with these forces. No matter how organized, how disciplined, or how virtuous, it is still subject to the currents, tides, and eventual calamities that the sea embodies. Plato emphasizes this through details. The central city is protected by concentric rings of water and land, yet the outermost ring connects to the ocean itself, a reminder that the boundaries of civilization are porous. Even the mightiest walls cannot entirely resist nature. The location of Atlantis, distant and powerful, yet vulnerable, reinforces the lesson about the limits of human control. The Atlantic, in Plato's narrative, is a space of reflection. It allows the audience to imagine what lies beyond the horizon, to ponder the vastness of the unknown. The very idea of a continent-sized island in those waters stretches the mind, asking the listener to consider the scale of human achievement and the consequences of hubris. By situating Atlantis in a place the Greeks could not easily verify, Plato also invites contemplation about evidence and memory. The story relies on accounts preserved across generations, passed from priests to statesmen, from Solon to Critias to Plato. The Atlantic functions as a metaphor for historical distance, where time and geography conspire to obscure truth. Yet despite its remoteness, Atlantis is not isolated from human experience. Its location amplifies the lessons Plato wishes to convey. Civilizations may appear invincible, yet they are fragile. They may grow wealthy and powerful, yet they remain subject to forces beyond their control. The Atlantic, endless and indifferent, is a constant reminder of mortality, both for individuals and empires. The choice of location also enhances the story's allure. It is easier to imagine human achievement when it is placed at the limits of the world. Atlantis becomes both tangible and dreamlike. Listeners can picture its mountains, plains, and canals, yet they know it lies in a space they may never reach. This distance creates a gentle tension, a calm wonder that carries through the narrative. Plato's calm narration encourages the mind to wander across the Atlantic. One can imagine standing at the cliffs of the Pillars of Hercules, peering into an endless horizon where the waters shimmer, and wondering what might exist beyond the sight of ordinary men. Atlantis exists in that space, at the boundary of imagination, history, and philosophy. In the calm retelling of its location, Plato subtly teaches patience and humility. Human knowledge is limited, and curiosity is eternal. The Atlantic separates, but it also invites. It is a place for thought, a canvas upon which the mind can paint civilizations of grandeur, virtue, and eventual decline. Through this deliberate placement, Plato ensures that Atlantis endures. It is anchored in geography, yet untethered from immediate reality. It is precise, yet open-ended. Listeners can measure it, imagine it, and reflect upon it without ever needing to see it directly. Its location reinforces its timelessness. In this way, the Atlantic is more than a setting. It is part of the lesson, part of the meditation, part of the quiet power of the story. For Plato, the story of Atlantis is not about conquest, maps, or proof. It is about reflection, contemplation, and understanding the fragile balance between human aspiration and the inexorable forces that shape the world. And so, the island rests beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a civilization suspended between history and myth, imagined across an ocean that stretches beyond knowledge, yet close enough to remind all who listen that greatness, like water, can flow, rise, and eventually recede. Imagine, if you will, a city unlike any you have seen before, a city built with careful symmetry, a place that seems to emerge from the dreams of a mind attuned to order and harmony. This is the heart of Atlantis, as Plato describes it, a city of concentric rings of land and water, rising from the sea like the gentle ripples from a stone cast into a still pond. The central island is the core, a raised platform of stone crowned by the royal palace and the great temple of Poseidon. Around it flow alternating bands of water and land, like rings on a jewel, each serving a purpose both practical and symbolic. The waters are not merely decorative. They provide defense, transportation, and access for ships of trade and war alike. The land rings, equally precise, support gardens, homes, and public spaces, each ring protected by walls that gleam in sunlight. The walls themselves are remarkable, shimmering with materials that the ordinary imagination struggles to picture. The outermost ring is sheathed in polished brass, catching the sun's rays and reflecting them across the harbour in a golden glow. The middle walls are coated in tin, gleaming silver-white, while the innermost fortifications closest to the palace are clad in the mysterious metal known as orichalcum, a substance Plato describes as second only to gold in brilliance. Its fiery glow is said to light the city in a warmth that seems almost magical. From above, the city resembles a target, concentric and precise, each ring a perfect circle around the next. Bridges and causeways link the land rings to one another, while tunnels beneath the waters allow ships to pass freely, moving from the outer harbour to the central island without ever touching the land. One can almost feel the cleverness of the engineers, the discipline of the workers, the meticulous care that must have gone into every stone, every canal, every gleaming wall. The central palace rises in quiet majesty, a structure of careful proportions, surrounded by gardens, baths, and sanctuaries. It is the home of the kings, rulers descended from Poseidon himself, and it is designed to reflect both their authority and the harmony of the city. The Temple of Poseidon dominates the landscape, its gleaming walls and tall pinnacles visible from every ring. Within it stands a colossal statue of the god, riding his chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, a vision in gold that reaches toward the ceiling. Around the god are statues of the first 10 kings of Atlantis, each accompanied by a queen immortalized in precious metal. Plato's description emphasizes not only grandeur, but functionality. Each ring, each canal, each wall serves multiple purposes. The waterways allow trade, irrigation, and navigation, while the land rings support agriculture, housing, and public spaces. Defense is built into the very geometry of the city, with walls that protect both citizens and rulers alike. The design is an expression of discipline, a reflection of the order Plato admired, and a tangible lesson in balance and foresight. Even the smallest details are deliberate. The canals are wide and deep, allowing ships to move through with ease. The bridges are engineered for both durability and elegance, their surfaces polished to a smooth perfection. Public spaces are arranged to facilitate gatherings, debates, and ceremonies, reflecting the city's commitment to civic life and structured society. Everything has its place, everything is interconnected, and nothing is left to chance. The shining walls are not mere decoration. They serve as a visual reminder of the city's wealth and power, a symbol of the Atlanteans' ambition and their divine lineage. The light glinting off brass, tin, and orichalcum is almost hypnotic, a reminder that the city is alive, shimmering with purpose and pride. Plato's narration allows the listener to visualize these walls in slow detail, to imagine sunlight reflecting across water and stone, filling the senses with quiet awe. The city is also carefully defended. Each ring is a layer of security, an obstacle for any who might attempt to attack. The concentric design allows defenders to move quickly, to isolate breaches, and to protect the central palace. The outer harbour accommodates ships large and small, merchant vessels and war. Galleys alike, creating a dynamic yet ordered network of movement and trade. The effect, Plato suggests, is almost hypnotic. A visitor would be awed by the precision and scale, the harmony of water and land, of walls and bridges, of gardens and canals. The city embodies a sense of calm order, a quiet discipline that reflects the virtue of its rulers. In its very layout, in the careful symmetry of its rings, there is a lesson about the value of structure, foresight, and balance. Even in its splendor, the city is a reflection of human nature. Its perfection is not absolute. It exists because of careful management, because of the virtue and wisdom of the kings who oversee it. Plato subtly reminds the listener that such harmony requires continuous care. The beauty of the rings, the brilliance of the walls, the elegance of the canals, all are maintained through discipline, observation, and responsibility. The city's layout also suggests philosophy in architecture. Order, symmetry, and proportion are not just aesthetic choices, they are expressions of moral and civic ideals. The concentric rings, the flowing waterways, the gleaming walls, they represent the balance between nature and civilization, between power and responsibility, between human ambition and divine guidance. The description encourages reflection rather than envy. The listener is invited to admire, to wonder, to imagine, but not to intervene. The city exists as a model, a meditation on what is possible when discipline, foresight, and virtue align. It is a place to contemplate the balance of human achievement, the fragility of order, and the quiet power of careful planning. Plato's calm narration lulls the mind into a slow rhythm, tracing the city's curves and canals, imagining sunlight dancing on metal, water flowing through tunnels, and the palace rising like a heart at the center of the world. One can almost hear the gentle lapping of water against stone, the quiet footsteps of citizens moving along streets paved with care, the soft rustle of trees in gardens carefully maintained. It is a city both magnificent and meditative, dazzling yet serene, precise yet alive. Each ring, each wall, each canal is part of a larger design, part of a vision of human potential, and part of a quiet reflection on the nature of order, virtue, and decline. Plato's listeners are invited to see, to imagine, and to think, not to question or argue, but to settle into the story, letting its rhythm and imagery shape their thoughts. The city of rings and shining walls, in Plato's hands, becomes more than a place. It becomes an idea, a meditation on human ambition and virtue, a quiet reminder that beauty and discipline, when combined with wisdom, create something extraordinary. And as one pictures the sunlight on orichalcum, the polished brass and silver, the concentric patterns stretching outward, it is easy to believe that such a city might have existed, or at least that it could exist in the mind, a model of civilis. Asian at its most reflective and harmonious. At the heart of Atlantis, atop the central island, stood a structure unlike any other in the ancient world. It was the Temple of Poseidon, a sanctuary of devotion and power, a place where the divine and human intersected. Its size alone would impress even the most seasoned traveller. From floor to ceiling it towered, commanding the attention of all who approached, and casting long shadows across the concentric rings of the city. The temple was rectangular, measuring 600 feet in length and 300 feet in width. Its walls gleamed, covered in silver, with pinnacles plated in gold that shimmered in the sunlight. The design of the building was both awe-inspiring and deliberate, crafted to reflect the glory of the god and the authority of the kings who ruled under him. Every line, every column, every gilded surface spoke of careful thought and reverence. Inside, the central figure captured the imagination. Poseidon himself, carved in gold, seated in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses. The statue reached toward the ceiling, filling the space with presence. Around him, 100 nereids rode dolphins, frozen in gold, moving in eternal motion through the shadows of the temple. It was a vision of divinity made tangible, a moment of the eternal caught in human hands. Beneath Poseidon, the first 10 kings of Atlantis and their queens stood in golden form, each representing one of the god's 10 sons who had divided the island among themselves. They were immortalized in precious metal, their likenesses serving as reminders of lineage, law, and legacy. Each statue bore witness to the sacred order of Atlantis, a testament to the balance between divine ancestry and mortal duty. But the temple was more than sculpture and splendor. It was the heart of Atlantean governance and ritual. The kings gathered here every 5th and 6th year, alternating, to deliberate on matters affecting the entire island. Disputes were resolved, oaths renewed, and laws upheld. This sacred space was where virtue was reinforced, where divine guidance and human judgment met in solemn harmony. Before making any major decisions, the kings performed rituals that Plato describes with meticulous care. Bulls were released into the temple grounds, pursued with staves rather than weapons, captured and sacrificed over a central pillar, inscribed with Poseidon's laws. The blood was mixed with wine, forming a ceremonial libation from which the kings drank before swearing their oaths. It was a ritual heavy with symbolism, a reminder that leadership carried both responsibility and consequence. The laws themselves, engraved on a pillar of orichalcum, were not abstract commands. They were practical, moral, and sacred, designed to guide rulers in the exercise of power. One of the most important laws forbade any king from waging war against another without the consent of the majority. The 10 kings were bound together, not merely by family, but by the framework of law, ritual, and divine expectation. The temple in this sense was both a sanctuary and a courtroom, a hall of worship and governance. Plato's description emphasizes the interplay of beauty, function, and morality. The temple was a physical embodiment of Atlantean ideals, Wealth tempered by virtue, power guided by law, and devotion paired with responsibility. Gold and silver were not mere decoration, they were statements of achievement, of respect for tradition, and of the sacred connection between rulers and the divine. Every detail of the temple was purposeful. The floors, polished to reflect light, created a sense of infinite space. The columns, arranged with symmetry, echoed the order of the city itself. The air within was heavy with the scent of incense and ritual, a subtle reminder that the divine could not be taken for granted. The space was designed to inspire awe, reflection, and a quiet understanding of human limitations. The temple also symbolized continuity. Poseidon, as the god of the sea, connected the island to forces beyond human control. The Atlanteans were powerful, skilled, and wealthy, yet even they were subject to the tides, the storms, and the will of the divine. The temple, standing at the city's heart, was a reminder that power required humility, that wealth demanded stewardship, and that leadership carried moral weight. Within this golden sanctuary, the kings were reminded of their lineage and obligations. The statues of their predecessors, cast in precious metal, served as silent teachers. The laws inscribed on orichalcum were both a guide and a warning to govern wisely, to honor the gods, and to uphold the principles of virtue. The ritual of sacrifice reinforced their connection to Poseidon, their acknowledgement of forces larger than themselves, and their commitment to maintain the delicate balance of the island. The calm of Plato's narration allows the listener to imagine this temple in detail. One can picture the sunlight streaming through gilded windows, reflecting off the golden statues and falling across the polished floors. One can hear the soft murmur of water from nearby canals, the distant echo of citizens moving along the city's concentric rings, and the low hum of ceremonial chants as the kings carry out their rituals. It is a space designed to engage the senses, but also the mind. The Temple of Poseidon is not simply about wealth or display. It is a meditation on power, ethics, and the connection between human and divine. It embodies the Atlanteans' attempt to anchor virtue in a physical space, to make morality tangible, and to create a city in which law, religion, and governance exist in perfect harmony. Even the smallest elements serve a purpose. Gardens and groves within the temple grounds provide quiet spaces for reflection. Baths for the kings and their families, separate from those of common citizens, reinforce the structured order of society. Facilities for horses, exercise area, and workshops for artisans highlight the integration of practical needs into sacred space. Every detail reflects a civilization attentive to both human comfort and divine expectation. The temple, in its calm majesty, becomes a mirror of the Atlantean ideal. It represents the peak of human ambition guided by virtue, a model of order, harmony, and reverence. Yet it also carries an implicit warning. Beauty, wealth, and power are fragile if not tempered by wisdom and morality. The temple is both a promise and a challenge, a sanctuary and a mirror, urging reflection on the responsibilities that accompany privilege. Plato's storytelling allows the mind to linger, to imagine the quiet splendor of gold and silver, the disciplined ritual of kings, and the solemnity of sacred law. One can almost hear the soft echo of footsteps, the gentle clang of ceremonial implements, the distant murmur of water from the surrounding canals, and the faint rustle of leaves from temple gardens. The Temple of Poseidon is a place frozen in time, a sanctuary of reflection, an enduring symbol of the balance between human ambition and the greater forces that shape the world. It is an invitation to ponder, to wonder, and to imagine a civilization where law, virtue, and reverence were as carefully constructed as its walls of shining metal, and in that calm, imagined space, the city of Atlantis breathes. Its rulers gather in solemn harmony, its citizens live under the watchful guidance of gods and kings, and its walls of gold and silver glint quietly in the Mediterranean sun. A vision of order, beauty, and fragile perfection. Atlantis, as Plato describes it, was more than a city. It was an empire, vast and magnificent, stretching its influence far beyond the central island and into the surrounding lands. Its reach was unprecedented, its ambition unmatched. Imagine fertile plains teeming with crops, forests heavy with timber, mines rich with metals, and rivers flowing full of life. Every natural resource seemed to belong to the Atlanteans, waiting for the guidance of their kings to be put to use. The people of Atlantis were numerous, though Plato offers only glimpses of the scale. The population was counted in tens of millions, a figure staggering for the ancient world. Citizens worked the lands, sailed the seas, and participated in the intricate systems that sustained this vast civilization. They built their canals, maintained their walls, and cultivated a society that for a time seemed almost perfect. Yet the empire's power extended far beyond agriculture and architecture. Its military was unparalleled. Plato lists numbers that almost defy belief: hundreds of thousands of soldiers, archers, slingers, chariots, and warships, all coordinated, trained, and ready for conflict. The Atlantean navy alone numbered 1,200 ships, each carrying 200 men. When summed, the total fighting force surpassed 1,000,000 soldiers, a scale unimaginable compared to contemporary Greek. City-states. This power, however, was not brute force alone. It was an empire governed by laws, by ritual, and by the oversight of kings who traced their lineage to Poseidon. The 10 kings divided the island among themselves, each ruling their domain with care, bound by oaths, and united by shared responsibility. The governance was both familial and sacred, a network of authority that kept the empire functioning with precision. Plato emphasizes that the Atlanteans' early rule was virtuous. Their divine blood, inherited from Poseidon, guided them toward wisdom, justice, and moderation. They were not conquerors at the start. They sought order, the flourishing of their society, and the maintenance of balance between wealth and responsibility. The people thrived under this guidance, living in a world abundant in resources, education, and opportunity. The empire's wealth, however, was a double-edged sword. With abundance came temptation, and with power the risk of corruption. Plato narrates how the divine essence that had sustained virtue began to fade as generations married mortals. Over time, the Atlanteans became more human, more fallible, and increasingly drawn toward excess. Wealth, once a tool for good, became a source of pride and indulgence. Power, once a duty, became a pursuit in itself. Their empire, once a model of balance and order, began to expand outward. Territories in Europe and Africa came under their influence. conquered by fleets and armies that seemed unstoppable. Blur. The Atlanteans' ambition was like a tide, growing stronger with each generation, fueled by their perception of invincibility. To outsiders, this empire must have seemed eternal, a force that could never falter, a civilization too vast to fail. Yet Plato, in his calm narration, subtly reminds us that all greatness is fragile. The very elements that made Atlantis magnificent, its wealth, its military strength, and its clever organization, also sowed the seeds of its decline. The Atlanteans' overreach, their hubris, and the dilution of their divine virtues set the stage for disaster. No empire, no matter how grand, is immune to the consequences of human error. The city, the rings, the shining walls, and the temples were all reflections of this grandeur, yet they were also reminders of vulnerability. The concentric design that protected the city could not shield it from the decay of virtue. The canals that fed the empire's wealth could not nourish wisdom. The statues of kings and queens in the temple of Poseidon could not enforce justice where human desire had eroded discipline. Plato's narrative draws attention to the paradox of power. The empire's reach made it legendary, yet its very scale concealed its fragility. A civilization so large, so organized, and so resource-rich could inspire awe, yet it could not escape the natural cycles of rise and fall. Its vast armies, its thousands of ships, and its golden temples, all symbols of human ingenuity, were powerless against time. Human weakness, and the forces of nature that would ultimately determine the fate of Atlantis, the Atlanteans' military might, was also a reflection of their pride. Discipline and order, so vital to their early success, was slowly overshadowed by ambition. Plato describes this shift with care, highlighting that moral and ethical decay often precedes physical decline. The very strength that allowed Atlantis to expand would later amplify its vulnerabilities, turning pride into a precursor for downfall. Despite the looming decay, the empire's achievements were remarkable. Its irrigation systems, transport networks, and urban planning suggest a society capable of coordinating enormous projects with precision. Its agricultural lands were vast, able to sustain the population and feed its armies. The mining of metals, including the mysterious orichalcum, provided resources for construction, defense, and ornamentation. The Atlanteans' mastery over both nature and craft created an empire that, for centuries, seemed almost eternal. Plato's calm storytelling allows the listener to picture this empire without alarm. One can imagine fertile plains stretching to the horizon, canals reflecting the sunlight like ribbons of silver, forests brimming with life, and mountains sheltering the lands from harsh winds. Cities within the empire buzzed with trade, crafts, and culture, all interconnected through the careful planning of rulers who once governed with virtue. The empire's fall is hinted at, not in noise or chaos, but in the quiet reflection of Plato's words. The transition from virtue to excess, from stewardship to ambition, is gradual, almost imperceptible. The Atlanteans are still impressive, still commanding, still extraordinary. Yet beneath the surface, the subtle erosion of ethics and moderation sets the stage for the inevitable catastrophe that will sweep across the empire. Plato encourages contemplation rather than fear. The story is not merely about conquest or destruction, but about the delicate balance between power and responsibility. He invites the listener to admire Atlantis, to sense its magnitude, and to reflect on the qualities that make any civilization enduring or fleeting. Power, wealth, and size may impress, but they cannot safeguard against moral decay or natural forces beyond human control. Through the calm, measured description of this empire, Plato allows us to linger in wonder. One can almost see the fleets moving along the canals, the armies drilling on open plains, the golden temples catching the morning sun. The empire's presence is overwhelming, yet it is described with gentle precision, encouraging the mind to imagine, to marvel, and to consider the lessons hidden within its grandeur. Atlantis, at its peak, seems too vast, too organized, too powerful to ever vanish. Yet Plato's storytelling is deliberate. He allows us to sense the fragility beneath the magnificence, the quiet tension between human ambition and the natural order. The empire may appear eternal in the imagination, but its ultimate fate is a reminder that even the mightiest civilizations are bound by forces larger than themselves. And so, we picture Atlantis at its height, an empire stretching across continents, filled with wealth, innovation, and unparalleled organization. Its cities shimmer in sunlight, its armies stand ready, its people live in abundance. Yet beneath the glittering surface, virtue wanes, ambition grows, and the calm rhythms of life carry the seeds of a future collapse that not even the golden walls can prevent. At the heart of Atlantis's power, beyond the golden walls and shimmering temples, lay something equally vital, yet far less glamorous: its farmland. Plato describes a landscape so carefully managed that it functioned almost like a living machine. It was not just soil and crops, it was a system designed with precision, thoughtfulness, and foresight, ensuring that the empire could feed its vast population and sustain its immense armies. The main plain of Atlantis stretched for thousands of stadia, a rectangular expanse framed by protective mountains and sheltered from the harsher northern winds. This was the foundation of life, the space where ordinary citizens, farmers, and laborers carried out their daily duties. The mountains around it were more than a natural barrier. They served as a reservoir of water and timber, feeding the canals, building materials, and the empire's ever-growing industries. Water was the life, blood of this machine. The Atlanteans engineered canals, wide and deep, crisscrossing the landscape like veins. The main canal, 300 feet wide and 100 feet deep, cut across the plain, linking the capital city to the sea. From it branched smaller channels that irrigated fields, transported timber, and allowed ships to move between islands without leaving the water. It was a feat of engineering that would challenge even modern imaginations. The canals were more than functional waterways, they were arteries of prosperity. Boats glided silently along them, carrying grains, fruits, and timber, their cargo destined for the city, the workshops, or distant lands within the empire. The sound of water flowing through carefully constructed channels created a soft, constant hum across the plains, a gentle reminder that the land itself was alive and working tirelessly for the people. Fields were meticulously planned. Crops were rotated and irrigated to maximize yield, ensuring that no soil lay fallow for long. Winter rains and summer irrigation worked in harmony with the canals, allowing farmers to grow a variety of produce year-round. Grains, vegetables, and fruits thrived, feeding both the population and the livestock that supported them. There was an abundance that seemed almost magical, the land itself, carefully managed, yielding far beyond what might have been expected. Timber, from the surrounding forests fed not only the construction of ships and buildings but also tea. He forges that transformed metal into tools, weapons, and ornaments. Mines produced gold, silver, bronze, and the mysterious orichalcum, fueling the empire's wealth and artistry. The resources of the land were harnessed systematically, as though the entire landscape had been designed to serve the empire efficiently and sustainably. The farmers, the silent backbone of Atlantis, carried out their work with care and diligence. Though Plato focuses less on them than on kings or temples, the description invites us to imagine their daily rhythm, tilling fields at dawn, guiding irrigation channels, tending to livestock, and transporting goods along the canals. Their lives were intertwined with the land, and through their labor the empire flourished. Without their hands, the shining walls and golden temples could not exist. Even the animals were part of the system. Horses had exercise grounds, used not only for sport but also for military readiness. Elephants, remarkable creatures unfamiliar to most of the ancient world, roamed freely, their presence both a resource and a symbol of power. Livestock grazed on the abundant pastures, contributing to both the diet and economy of the Atlanteans. Every living thing, it seems, had its place in this vast agricultural web. The precision of this system was remarkable, particularly for a civilization operating with Bronze Age technology. Canals had to be maintained, water levels managed, and crops carefully monitored. The land was engineered to amplify productivity, creating a feedback loop where labor, natural resources, and ingenuity combined to produce extraordinary results. The Atlanteans had essentially created a civilization in which survival was no longer a struggle, freeing their minds to pursue art, governance, and ambition. Plato invites the listener to picture standing at the edge of these plains. Mountains rise behind you, their snow-capped peaks glinting in the sun. In front, fields stretch toward the horizon, green and gold under the warmth of the Mediterranean sky. Water flows in orderly channels, glinting as it reflects the sunlight. Boats move slowly along the canals, laden with goods. Smoke rises from distant forges and workshops, the rhythmic hammering mingling with the distant murmur of people working, living, and sustaining the empire. The abundance and organization of this agricultural machine contributed directly to the empire's stability and power. Food was never scarce, soldiers were fed, and artisans had materials to craft both practical and ornamental objects. In this way, the land itself became a partner in the empire's success, a quiet but essential component of Atlantean might. Without fertile fields, irrigated canals, and careful management, even the wealthiest city would crumble. Yet there is also a subtle lesson in Plato's description. The system, so extraordinary and well-maintained, also reminds us of fragility. Everything depends on balance, on adherence to the principles that go. Vernit, a failure in water management, a disruption in labor, or the loss of ethical leadership could ripple across the land with consequences as severe as any battle. Nature and human oversight are intertwined, and neither can be taken for granted. The empire's agricultural machine was not merely about survival. It was about possibility. It allowed the Atlanteans to imagine, to plan, to construct, and to govern on a scale unmatched in the ancient world. The land, carefully engineered, provided the resources necessary for a civilization to reach extraordinary heights. In Plato's calm storytelling, one can almost feel the hum of life across the plains, the gentle movement of water, and the quiet diligence of people working together in harmony with nature. In this serene, ordered landscape, the empire thrived. Fields produced abundance, rivers carried sustenance, and the machinery of agriculture fed both the ordinary and the extraordinary. It was a civilization where survival was secured, and where human ambition could reach beyond mere subsistence to pursue greatness, beauty, and order. Plato's narration allows the listener to imagine Atlantis not as a mythical place of random wonders, but as a civilization grounded in practical brilliance. The canals, the fields, the irrigation systems, all of these are expressions of intelligence, foresight, and coordination, creating a backdrop for the grandeur of the cities, the temples, and the armies. And so, the plains of Atlantis stretch endlessly in the imagination, fertile, irrigated, full of life, and humming with quiet productivity. The empire's strength lies not only in its walls or wealth, but in this very system, this living machine that transforms the land into sustenance, prosperity, and possibility. It is a reminder that even the greatest empires rely on the simple, steady work of people and the careful management of the natural world, weaving together a civilization too vast, too intricate, and too alive to be easily forgotten. In the earliest days of Atlantis, the island's rulers were unlike any ordinary mortals. Plato tells us that Poseidon, the god of the sea, fell in love with a mortal woman named Plato. He built a palace for her on the central island, surrounded by concentric rings of water and land that gleamed in the sunlight. From their union came 10 sons, and these sons inherited not just life but divine blood, a connection to the gods themselves. It was this divine lineage that shaped the first kings of Atlantis. They were born into wisdom, courage, and temperance, traits that came not solely from human nurture, but from divine inheritance. Plato emphasizes that the early Atlanteans were virtuous because they were part god. They ruled their domains with fairness, deliberated thoughtfully with one another, and governed in a way that balanced power with responsibility. The golden age of Atlantis was not measured merely in wealth or military might, but in harmony. The 10 kings, each ruling a portion of the island, convened regularly in the temple of Poseidon. Here, amidst the silver-plated walls and golden statues, they deliberated on matters affecting the entire island. Every decision was tempered with consideration, every law weighed with care, and every dispute resolved through measured judgment. Plato paints these gatherings with reverence. Before making major decisions, the kings performed rituals to honor the god who had given them life and guidance. Bulls were released in the temple grounds, and the kings captured them using staves and ropes, following ancient ceremonies passed down through generations. The blood of the sacrifice was mixed with wine, and each king swore sacred oaths upon it. These rituals were more than tradition. They were a living symbol of unity, accountability, and respect for the divine order that structured their society. In this age, the empire's economy flourished. Crops grew abundant on the vast plains, irrigated by channels that reflected the sunlight like silver threads. Timber flowed from forested mountains to feed construction, tools, and workshops. Mines yielded metals, including the mysterious orichalcum, whose fiery gleam decorated the temples and palaces. Every resource was used with thought, ensuring both the prosperity of the people and the stability of the empire. The people of Atlantis lived well. Ordinary citizens enjoyed public baths with hot and cold running water. gardens filled with flowers and herbs and spac. ES for learning and recreation. Education was not reserved for the elite alone. Children learned to read and write, and artisans practiced their crafts with skill and pride. Even the animals were cared for thoughtfully. Horses had exercise grounds, elephants roamed freely, and livestock grazed on well-managed pastures, each fulfilling its role in the grand design of the empire. The kings themselves were both rulers and stewards, responsible not only for defense and administration, but for guiding their people toward virtue. They oversaw trade, negotiated treaties, and ensured that justice was upheld. Their divine heritage, Plato suggests, gave them insight and restraint. They could command armies, yet they did so without cruelty. They could accumulate wealth, yet they did not let it dominate their hearts. The balance between human and divine shaped the empire into a civilization that, for a time, seemed perfect. In this golden age, ambition did not corrupt. Expansion occurred in measured ways, guided by wisdom rather than greed. The Atlanteans defended their lands against external threats, but did not dominate for the sake of power alone. Their navy, their armies, and their infrastructure supported the empire's well-being rather than feeding excess. Citizens could live in safety, knowing that their rulers were wise, that resources were abundant, and that justice was not an abstraction but a practice. Plato's account emphasizes the fragility of this balance. Divine blood, the ver-e, wry essence of virtue, needed to be maintained. Marriages between the royal lines and mortals were carefully managed at first, preserving the qualities that made the kings capable, ethical, and strong. The gods themselves, through Poseidon, seemed to watch over the island, ensuring that the rulers upheld their duties. It was a time when the human and the divine coexisted in careful harmony, creating a society both prosperous and morally centered. Yet even in this age of light, subtle cracks could be seen if one looked closely. Plato notes that the very abundance which allowed Atlantis to flourish also carried a risk. With resources plentiful and the population growing, the temptation for excess existed quietly beneath the surface. Even divine blood, he suggests, is not an eternal shield against the slow erosion of virtue. The Golden Age, radiant and inspiring, was a stage in a story that Plato carefully structures to show both potential and vulnerability. The central island, crowned with the Temple of Poseidon, symbolized this Golden Age. The temple, lined with silver, capped with gold, and containing the monumental statue of Poseidon, represented the power and responsibility of divine kingship. Here, wisdom, courage, and justice were not abstract ideals. They were enacted, ritualized, and embodied. It was a place of ceremony and decision, where human action intersected with divine expectation. Daily life in Atlantis reflected the values of the Golden Age. Citizens contributed to the society not only through labor, but through participation in a system that valued cooperation, balance, and respect. The harmony of canals, fields, and cities mirrored the harmony the kings sought to maintain in governance. The people's well-being was inseparable from the ethical exercise of power, illustrating Plato's belief that morality and prosperity were intertwined. Plato allows us to see the Golden Age not as a myth, but as a lived reality within his story, vivid and concrete. We can imagine walking along the canals as sunlight glints on the water, passing fields rich with grain and gardens filled with fragrant herbs. In the distance, golden temples rise above the city, and the voices of kings and citizens alike blend with the rhythm of daily life. There is beauty, order, and purpose in every detail. In this age, the Atlanteans' divine lineage was not a distant legend. It was a force shaping decisions, guiding behavior, and preserving a civilization that could have endured for centuries. The empire seemed timeless, almost eternal, as though the gods themselves had anchored it in perfection. Citizens and rulers alike thrived, not only because of material abundance, but because virtue was the foundation of all activity. Yet Plato's calm narration carries an underlying caution. Even in a golden age, the seeds of decay are present, hidden in human ambition, in the passing of generations, and in the subtle dilution of divine blood. The story of Atlantis, in its earlies, T-Days, is a meditation on both greatness and vulnerability, a vision of how extraordinary societies can flourish when virtue guides power. And so, the listener is left to picture the Atlantean Golden Age, an empire alive with order, wealth, and purpose, kings who rule with divine insight, citizens who live in safety, abundance, and opportunity, and the land itself, a partner in sustaining life. It is a civilization that seems untouchable, a harmony between human effort and divine blessing, a world glowing with the promise of enduring greatness. Time, Plato reminds us, has a way of quietly reshaping even the mightiest of civilizations. In the beginning, Atlantis was radiant with virtue, guided by kings whose blood was part divine, and by citizens whose lives were intertwined with wisdom, labor, and respect. But as centuries passed, subtle shifts began to take root, almost imperceptibly. The Golden Age, so carefully maintained, was not eternal. The first signs of change were not dramatic. They were whispers, almost unnoticed by ordinary citizens. The kings, once unified in purpose, began to marry outside their divine lineages more frequently. The qualities inherited from Poseidon, the wisdom, temperance, and courage, began to dilute. Generations passed, and with each one, the divine blood that had once safeguarded Atlantis weakened. This was not a sudden fall. It was a slow creeping shift, like water gradually eroding stone. With the erosion of divine virtue came the rise of artal desire. Ambition, once tempered by ethics, became increasingly entangled with personal gain. Kings who were meant to uphold justice and fairness began to see wealth as an end in itself rather than a means to support the people. The lavish palaces that had once symbolized harmony and divine order now inspired envy, pride, and competition. Gold, silver, and orichalcum no longer reminded rulers of responsibility. They became objects of obsession. The people, too, felt the change, though not always consciously. Trade continued. The canals still carried goods, and the agricultural fields thrived, but the balance that had guided life on Atlantis was weakening. Decisions that had once been made with deliberation began to favor ambition over virtue. Policies that had protected equality and fairness started to tilt toward privilege and power. It was not chaos, not yet. It was a subtle corrosion, the gentle drift of a society away from its guiding principles. Plato describes the military with astonishing detail, revealing both the might and the growing imbalance. Atlantis had armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, a naval fleet beyond imagining, and warriors trained to perfection. Yet as corruption grew, these forces became instruments not of defense or collective safety, but of conquest and pride. The armies that had once protected the virtuous island now served the ambitions of kings increasingly divorced from the ideals of their forefathers. Even the temple rituals on CE sacred and binding began to lose their significance. The blood oaths, the ceremonial offerings, the deliberations in the temple of Poseidon, symbols of unity and divine guidance, started to feel like tradition for tradition's sake. They became routines, performances that maintained the appearance of order while masking the erosion of virtue. Power, Plato shows, can tolerate routine without morality, but only for so long. Plato's calm storytelling allows the listener to feel the subtlety of this decline. You can imagine walking along the canals where once there was harmony, now hearing murmurs of dissent among the kings. You see wealth accumulating not as a reflection of productivity, but as an instrument of pride. You sense a change in tone, not in catastrophe yet, but in the quiet ambition that will, over time, grow into greed. The divine blood which had sustained the ruler's insight was diluted not by external forces, but by natural human inclination. Marriages with mortals, decisions driven by desire, and generational drift gradually replaced divine wisdom with ordinary human ambition. Plato emphasizes that it was not sudden hubris, but a slow, cumulative effect. One generation's compromise became the next generation's expectation, and soon the empire that had once seemed eternal began to wobble on the foundations of its own ethics. This slow corruption touched every aspect of life. Trade and commerce, once guided by fairness and long-term planning, became more about ACC, emulation and dominance. Military campaigns, originally designed for protection and stability, increasingly reflected pride and overreach. Art, philosophy, and civic life, while still remarkable, began to show signs of elitism, serving the powerful more than the collective good. The society that had been designed for balance now tilted incrementally toward excess. Yet life for ordinary citizens often remained deceptively stable. Fields produced abundance, canals flowed with goods, and cities functioned efficiently. Plato's narrative captures the irony beautifully. Outward appearances of harmony persisted even as the moral and ethical core eroded. People continued their daily routines, unaware that the subtle decay would, in time, touch every part of their lives. Atlantis appeared immortal, serene, and prosperous. Yet beneath the gleaming surfaces, the seeds of decline were growing. Plato's description of this era is almost hypnotic, encouraging the listener to imagine a world of contrasts, shining temples and corroding virtue, abundant fields and creeping ambition, ritualized ceremonies masking moral drift. The slow corruption is not a tale of sudden collapse, but of quiet, imperceptible change that gathers strength over generations. It is a reminder that even the strongest civilizations are vulnerable to time and human weakness. And so, the Atlanteans continued, caught in the gentle but relentless pull of desire and human nature. The divine blood of their kings, once a source of guidance and balance, was increasingly overshadowed by pride and ambition. Decisions once guided by wisdom now leaned toward self-interest. The rituals that had bound rulers together began to echo as empty words, and the system that had sustained harmony started to wobble. Plato's calm, measured voice in the story conveys both beauty and warning. The empire remains magnificent, with golden walls, thriving canals, and fertile plains. Yet, For all its grandeur, there is a quiet tension in the air, the subtle indication that the island's greatest strength, the virtue of its rulers, is beginning to fade. It is a delicate balance, maintained for a time, but slowly giving way to the inevitable flaws of mortal ambition. Through this narrative, Plato seems to suggest that corruption need not be dramatic to be effective. It is the slow accumulation of compromise, the unnoticed shifts in priorities, and the quiet indulgence of desire that eventually erode even the most powerful of civilizations. Atlantis, for now, stands magnificent, yet it teeters on the threshold where virtue and vice begin to contend. In this calm and reflective mood, the listener can almost feel the pulse of Atlantis slowing in subtle ways. The waters of the canals still shimmer, the fields still wave in the sun, the temples still gleam. But beneath it all, the imperceptible force of slow corruption begins to twist intentions, cloud judgment, and sow the first seeds of imbalance. The island, perfect in its early day, is no longer unassailable. It is alive, yes, but vulnerable. And so, in the quiet rhythm of daily life, in the hum of canals and the rustle of wheat, the first hints of Atlantis's decline take root. It is not sudden, not catastrophic, but gradual, creeping, and insidious. Plato's words linger like a soft whisper. Even the mightiest empire, built on divine blood and wisdom, is subject to time, human weakness, and the inexorable drift of desire. The slow corruption, almost invisible in the moment, will eventually shape the destiny of the greatest civilization the world has ever imagined. The Atlanteans, once guided by virtue and divine blood, now found themselves at a crossroads they did not fully perceive. Their empire had grown vast, wealthy, and powerful, yet beneath the gleaming temples and well-tended fields, a subtle decay had taken root. Greed, ambition, and the dilution of divine guidance had shifted the balance. Plato's narrative now turns to a moment of reckoning, one that comes not with fanfare, debate, or warning, but silently, inexorably, as if the island itself were holding its breath. Plato describes the gods, observing from their distant heights, seeing the slow transformation of a civilization once radiant with wisdom. Poseidon, the father of the Atlantean kings, and Zeus, the king of the gods, gather in council to weigh the fate of this mighty empire. Their judgment, when it comes, is deliberate but unspoken in the mortal world. The kings, the citizens, Eve, the soldiers and artisans, the island's inhabitants are unaware of the invisible hand hovering over them, guiding the inevitable consequences of their choices. This judgment is not the dramatic clash of armies or the shattering of cities we might expect in ordinary tales of destruction. It is quiet, almost imperceptible, as if the earth itself were assessing the moral fabric of the Atlantean civilization. Plato's words convey a stillness that is almost hypnotic. You can imagine the kings seated in their golden halls, unaware that forces beyond their comprehension are weighing their deeds, noting their pride, their ambition, and their neglect of virtue. The gods do not speak to warn. They do not intervene to rescue. Instead, they allow events to unfold in accordance with the principles they have long established. Justice, in this case, is not delivered through human argument or debate. It is enacted through nature itself, through the rising of waters, the trembling of the earth, and the inexorable patterns that Plato describes as part of the world's balance. The judgment is invisible, yet absolute. Plato invites the listener to imagine the Atlantean rulers in their palace chambers. They review reports from the provinces, plan campaigns of conquest, and debate trade and taxation. Their voices echo in the marbled halls, but none of them can hear the quiet murmurs of the natural order responding to their corruption, the concentration of power, the indulgence in wealth, and the more drift of generations have set into motion consequences that cannot be contained. The empire's structures, both literal and symbolic, remain magnificent. The concentric rings of water and land shine in the sunlight, temples glitter with silver and gold, and the statue of Poseidon towers in the heart of the capital, a reminder of the divine origins of the kings. Canals carry water and ships, fields yield crops, and workshops hum with activity. From the outside, Atlantis appears indomitable, serene, and eternal, yet Plato's narrative teaches that appearances can deceive. The judgment is as much about the unseen erosion of virtue as it is about tangible misdeeds. It is measured in decisions made for self-interest rather than the collective good, in rituals performed as tradition rather than as true homage, and in ambition that overshadows wisdom. Plato emphasizes that the collapse of the empire, when it comes, is not merely physical. It is moral, structural, and inevitable, a consequence of choices ignored over generations. There is an eerie quiet in this part of the story. The god's decision unfolds not through thunder or fire, but through the natural world responding to the moral imbalance. The earth is patient, the seas are patient, yet they carry within them the power to enact absolute justice. Plato describes this with the calm precision of a storyteller observing a long, slow process. The island is vibrant, alive, and humming with activity, yet every action contributes to the eventual reckoning. Citizens continue their daily routines, unaware that the island is approaching a point of no return. Farmers tend fields, artisans craft, children learn, and soldiers drill, all in rhythm with the empire's apparent prosperity. Plato's narration emphasizes the normalcy of life at this stage, highlighting the contrast between human perception and the silent judgment that has already begun. There is no alarm, no herald of doom, only the quiet certainty of consequences arriving as they must. Even the kings whose decisions have shaped the empire for generations do not perceive the verdict forming. Their discussions, disputes, and strategies continue, yet each action subtly moves Atlantis closer to the moment when the divine will asserts itself. Plato's words suggest a universe where morality and consequence are inextricably linked, where judgment is not always dramatic or immediate, but is no less certain for being silent. The scale of the empire, which once ensured abundance, now magnifies the consequences of corruption. Every misused resource, every unjust decree, and every act of greed echoes through the canals, fields, and cities. The balance that once sustained Atlantis begins to falter, not abruptly, but with the quiet inevitability of time and consequence. Plato encourages the listener to feel the weight of this unseen judgment, to sense that even in the midst of wealth and beauty, a moral reckoning is at hand. Plato's storytelling in this chapter is almost meditative. One can imagine lying in bed, listening to the calm description of the empire's daily life, and feeling the quiet pressure of unseen forces gathering. There is no panic, no shouting, no immediate catastrophe, only the slow, patient shaping of destiny. It is a judgment without voice, yet it is no less absolute, no less profound. Through this silent judgment, Plato presents a timeless lesson. Power, wealth, and ingenuity cannot protect a civilization from the consequences of moral decay. The gods, in their quiet observation, are not tyrannical but impartial. They allow human actions to play out, to reveal the consequences of choices, and to demonstrate the delicate balance between virtue and vice. The silent hand of justice touches every part of life, from kings in their palaces to farmers in the fields. Even as the empire hums with activity, the seeds of final catastrophe are sown. Plato describes the inevitability with calm precision, encouraging the listener to sense that judgment is not an event but a process. It is woven into the structure of the world, unfolding slowly, measuredly, like the rising tide or the silent erosion of a cliff by the sea. Atlantis appears untouched, yet the forces of consequence are already at work. In this serene and reflective chapter, Plato teaches that silence does not mean inaction, and invisibility does not mean absence. The judgment of Atlantis comes quietly, in the rhythm of nature, in the erosion of virtue, and in the cumulative effect of choices ignored. There is no voice to announce it, no warning trumpet, only the steady, invisible hand of justice guiding the destiny of an empire that once seemed eternal. And so, as we imagine the canals flowing, the fields waving in the sun, and the golden walls of the city shimmering, we also feel the weight of an unseen verdict. Every act, every decision, every compromise contributes to the unfolding story. Judgment has begun, though the Atlanteans remain unaware. It is patient, impartial, and inevitable, a quiet reminder that even the greatest civilizations are bound by moral consequence, and that the fall of the mighty often begins in silence, long before the first tremors shake their walls. Time moves quietly. The sun rises and sets over Atlantis, painting its golden walls and silver temples in shades of fire and shadow. Life continues as it always has. The farmers tend their fields, the artisans hammer away in forges, and the children laugh and run through streets paved with stone. The canals shimmer in the sunlight, the ships float gently, and the temple of Poseidon towers like a monument to divine order. And yet, beneath this surface of serene activity, the balance of the island has been quietly unraveling for generations. Plato's narrative has guided us through centuries of virtue, corruption, ambition, and the subtle drift of human nature. Now it arrives at the moment that has haunted imaginations for over 2 millennia, the final silent fall of Atlantis. Plato D. ascribes this catastrophe not with dramatic fanfare or the roar of armies, but with a calm, almost meditative precision. The earth trembles first, quietly, beneath the feet of kings and citizens alike. Not a violent quake at once, but a gentle shivering at first, so subtle that one might mistake it for a trick of the mind, the sway of the ground beneath daily life. The sea responds with equal quietude, rising slowly at first, then with inexorable strength, washing over the concentric rings of water and land, the golden and silver walls, which had reflected sunlight and served as symbols of power and beauty, now become mirrors of inevitability. The shimmering metals gleam in the last light of day, as if acknowledging that the empire they protected will soon be no more. Canals overflow, docks crumble. The harbour, once filled with thousands of ships, now rocks gently in rising waters, each vessel a silent witness to the collapse that comes not with rage, but with certainty. Plato's description emphasizes the scale of this judgment. It is not a small disaster affecting one city or one district. It is the end of an entire civilization, both moral and material. Every palace, every workshop, every temple, every home is touched by the silent hand of consequence. The statues of kings and queens, crafted in gold and orichalcum, reflect a civilization at the height of achievement and yet on the brink of erasure. Even Poseidon, whose blood once ran through the veins of the royal line, walked his in solemn detachment. There is no panic in the narrative. There is no screaming, no chaos in the streets. Instead, life continues, as if suspended in a slow-motion tableau. Families eat, children play, and soldiers march, unaware of the approaching end. Plato's storytelling conveys the quiet inevitability of the fall. It is a natural, almost serene judgment, executed not by anger, but by the slow unfolding of consequences that centuries of choices have set into motion. The divine forces, having observed the moral decay and human failings of Atlantis, now allow nature itself to enact their will. Earthquakes split the land, fissures open, and the canals that had been the lifeblood of agriculture and transport become rivers of destruction. The mountains that once sheltered the plains now crumble in their own weight, guiding the waters toward the heart of the empire. Even the natural world participates in this judgment, its rhythm calm yet relentless. Plato's narrative is rich in imagery, almost hypnotic in its calmness. You can picture the central island with the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon, the gleaming statue of the god still towering as the waters lap at its base. The concentric rings of land and water, once symbols of order and divine protection, now become channels through which the sea quietly claims its domain. Ships, docks, and gardens vanish beneath the rising tide. The noise of daily life fades, replaced by the gentle, inescapable rhythm of destruction. Even as the physical empire falls, Plato emphasizes that Atlantis's moral and spiritual essence had already been in decline. The silent catastrophe mirrors the slow corruption that had crept in over generations. The god's judgment is not just about punishment, it is about balance. The island, magnificent and powerful, had grown arrogant, greedy, and disconnected from virtue. Its fall, though silent, is the inevitable consequence of choices ignored and responsibilities abandoned. There is a strange beauty in this quiet destruction. The last sunlight glimmers on walls and canals. The last birds circle the skies, and the people, oblivious to their fate, continue their routines. Plato's words suggest a universe where even the greatest power is subject to imperceptible, unstoppable forces. The fall is absolute, but it is delivered with the gentleness of inevitability rather than the terror of chaos. It is a lesson in the subtlety of consequences, in the quiet authority of nature and the moral universe. The narrative lingers on details, making the loss almost tangible. Imagine standing on the highest tower of the royal palace as the waters rise. You see the gleaming walls of brass, tin, and orichalcum reflecting the sun one last time. The statue of Poseidon, once central to the city's identity, is partially submerged, its golden chariot glinting in the shifting light. Canals overflow, carrying ships slowly into the open sea. Forests, farms, and workshops vanish beneath the waves, and the sounds of daily life are replaced by the soft hush of water reclaiming the land. Even the people's virtues and failings vanish quietly. The citizens who had worked, loved, learned, and dreamed are swallowed along with the empire, leaving behind only memory and story. Plato's account does not linger on horror. It dwells instead on the inevitability and serenity of a moral universe in which actions and choices, however slow to manifest, are always accounted for. The Silent Fall of Atlantis is also a mirror of Athens, Plato reminds us. Just as the island, so grand and perfect, succumbed to the consequences of moral decline, so too can human civilizations everywhere drift toward ruin when virtue is abandoned. The story, though ancient and fantastical, carries a timeless message. Power, wealth, and ingenuity cannot protect a society from the consequences of neglecting wisdom, justice, and courage. The fall may be quiet, but it is inexorable. As the waves rise, the temples, palaces, and bustling streets disappear beneath the ocean, and the once mighty empire becomes a memory preserved only in distant lands, in stories passed from one generation to the next. Plato's narrative, carefully constructed, allows us to imagine the scene in vivid detail while maintaining the calm rhythm of a bedtime story, blending wonder with the weight of moral reflection. Even as Atlantis sinks, there is a certain solemn beauty. The sea reclaims what was always impermanent, and the land once shape. By ambition and virtue alike, returns to silence. The golden walls, the silver-lined temples, the bustling harbours, and the fertile plains all vanish beneath the waves, leaving only echoes in the imagination. Plato's words preserve them, not as a warning of terror, but as a meditation on the fragility of even the greatest achievements. And so, the story of Atlantis ends not with fanfare or clamour, but with gentle inevitability. The empire, magnificent yet flawed, disappears beneath the waters of the Atlantic. The god's judgment is enacted quietly, perfectly, and without need for proclamation. The island and its people, both virtuous and flawed, become a story, a memory for those who would listen, a lesson for those who would reflect. Plato leaves us with the profound silence of the fall, a civilization undone not by a single catastrophe, but by the cumulative weight of centuries of human choices, ambition, and moral decline. And in that silence, as the waters close over golden walls and temples, the story lingers, timeless, as a meditation on virtue, power, and the impermanence of even the grandest human endeavour. Atlantis is gone. Its legacy is memory, imagination, and the quiet lesson that no matter how bright or powerful, every civilization carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. And perhaps, in the calm hush of reflection, the story of Atlantis continues to teach us, gently, about the fragile balance between wisdom and desire, virtue and ambition, creation and kernel, lapse